Yeah, it's an incredible pleasure. Thanks, John. And it's an incredible pleasure to introduce Sally. I think Sally is a real, for those of you who know, is an absolute force of nature and a force for good in our world of psychology and therapy and social change, and has been really involved in co-founding and developing community psychology, which has a lot of links with what we're trying to do in Task in terms of looking at therapeutic and psychological change at the community level and in terms of social justice as well as at the more individual level. Sally has also been really involved in co-founding Psychologists for Social Change, which is like a parallel organisation to Therapists for Social Change. Really worth, maybe at some point we'll put in the link for that. They have a really lively WhatsApp group as well as other things that go on, and I think there's lots of really good parallels between the work that Task does and Psychologists for Social Change. Sally's working as CEO of Art Against Knives, and we did a podcast interview, and I put the link in there with Sally a while back, a few months back. And if you're interested in more about kind of Sally's background and how she came into the work, I'm sure she'll talk about that somewhere like today. But also do have a look at the listen to the podcast. And with that, Sally, I'll pass over to you. And yeah, really looking forward to hearing what you're going to tell us about.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Mick and John. Yeah, really appreciate the invitation. And I titled it about lessons learned from the experiences that I've personally had on my journey. And just doing this, putting these slides together and thinking about what lessons I have learned has been really helpful. So thank you for giving me the opportunity and reason to do that. It's not something that you kind of do unless you are creating something purposeful around it. So thank you. And it's really lovely to be here with all of you. I don't know everyone's background, obviously, or what you're all already doing. And I'm sure you all could probably do this talk and share your lessons and learning of the work that you're all doing around this topic of social change and psychology, mental health, therapy. So I've tried to put in some gaps for sort of thoughts and reflections, or as John was saying, please do use the chat if there's anything you'd like to add. If I don't see it straight away, forgive me, I will try and come back to it. But I want to acknowledge that I'm sure there's lots of people and experience in this virtual room. But Wesley, if you wouldn't mind sharing my slides, I'm going to be looking at my own slides on my screen. So forgive me again if I don't see you all straight away. I've got some sort of speaker notes, and hopefully, Wesley, you'll see when I move my my slides, and you'll be able to follow when to move them, but let me know if that's not working. So yeah, my name's Sally. I'm a clinical and community psychologist by background, and currently a CEO of a charity in North London called Art Against Knives, which I'm going to come on to. But I suppose since qualifying as a clinical psychologist back in 2010, I've pretty much not practiced as a clinical psychologist since then, and for many, many reasons. But mostly, I suppose, because I found it incredibly neglectful of issues that concerned me around justice and equity and inclusion and all the things that I cared about in terms of those values. And I discovered along the way community psychology, and I went straight. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of my experience, so you know where my lessons are coming from. Just so you know what I've been involved with, so you can then see where I'm coming from, hopefully. So I've been trying to personally, and with many others, practice differently as a psychologist since the beginnings of my career, really. And my first experience of that was going to work. As soon as I qualified, I actually didn't go into the NHS, which is where most clinical psychologists work, but went to work for a charity called MAC UK, originally called Music and Change. First minor lesson, try not to call your charity name Mac, which is the name of a computer brand, a makeup brand and gets very confusing for people. But Music and Change or MAC UK, we started. There was it wasn't me who specifically founded it, but I was there from quite early on, and it was in 2008. And the idea was all about working very differently in partnership with some of London's most excluded young people to address health and social inequalities and create and design mental health services fit for the 21st century and fit for a community of young people that otherwise didn't access traditional therapy or mental health services. Back then, young people used to be referred to as affiliated in gangs or or offenders, and one of the first things we did was look at that language. And as is always the way, language is always changing and updating. So at that point,
Sally.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you, Sally, but we're not able to see your screen. So just
if you go to the next
a little audio cue, great.
Okay, I'll try and do a little point. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for letting me know.
Oh, thank you, Sally.
This is just they're just sort of little pictures to bring it to life.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move to the next one. The next slide. So MAC UK, when I was there for 10 years, and one of our mantras is this: when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows and not the flower. And that sort of is the heart of a lot of community psychology. And again, for those who know about community psychology and this type of work, this will be familiar, but it's this idea of the context is everything. And the context in which young people are growing up, for example, or the context in which they're living their lives in the communities and what resources they have or don't have, is a huge part of our own individual and collective and community level well-being. And I'll go to the next slide. So I did that for 10 years and in different roles alongside. And then I went to work for Nesta, which is a very different foundation, a very different charity. It's much bigger, it's got a lot of money, and it's a grant maker and policy and research think tank. But it's all about bringing innovation, social innovation, and bringing bold ideas to life to change the world for good. And in that role, I was working on this program called Social Movements for Health. And that was all about working with groups of people who were trying to address health inequalities by starting movements. And we're at the early stage of starting movements. So we were working with people with learning disabilities who were trying to create a movement around the health inequalities of people with learning disabilities. We were working with a group who were trying to build a movement around the experiences of Black queer men, and many others. And it was all about how can you fund and support the building of movements to address health inequalities. And there was also a group working directly on things that I was interested in, which was how do we do that for mental health inequalities as well? Like how do we address social change to address mental health inequalities? And then the next slide. And as a part of all of these different experiences, I was also moved at this time. This was a sort of the context at this time was austerity. And this was sort of 2014-15. And we were all experiencing the impact of austerity, especially young people at that time I was working with at MAC UK. And now, of course, the context is the cost of living crisis. It's the context of immigration and far right movement. But at that time, it was austerity. And so this is what inspired a few of us to really think about what is our role in demonstrating the link that we were seeing on the ground between austerity and austerity policies and the impact it was having on people's mental distress. I'm going to come on to that a bit more. And then finally now, where I am, if we go on to the next slide, this is Art Against Knives, where I've been for 4 years as the CEO. And this is, we're a small grassroots charity based in North London with a vision that every young person can build a life they want through creativity and free from violence. And a lot of the ways that community psychology works is very different through to, you know, the individual therapy work that we often get taught within mental health services and education, as I'm going to come on to. And it's much more about working with groups and peer groups and seeing peer support as very important and valid, lived experience as very important and valid ways of supporting people, and really seeing collective action as part of a mental health intervention. And within Art Against Knives, we work with 10 to 25-year-olds and develop creative programs, and then offer sort of a lot of wraparound support around that. And I'll say a bit more about that later on. So that's a little brief of my where I've been and what I've been up to. And I start on the next slide, which is what have been some of my lessons. And as I say, I know you all have many yourselves, and I suppose these were the ones that I just thought about that came very clearly to me, and why work differently and was part of it. But I suppose the beginnings of that are in this lesson, which was, for me, it's been in partnership with others, all about initiative. Like, none of us have ever been invited to work differently or to think about the social context in great detail, in great depth in our work. It wasn't in a lot of our education, our psychological education. And in fact, it was almost the opposite, which I'm going to come on to, of like making those links about the important role of social justice, racial justice, economic justice. Although, as with everything, the context in which you work or the setting makes taking initiative more or less difficult. So I'm going to bring that to life a little bit. The next slide is, I don't know if any of you will have done undergraduate psychology, but this was something that we learned at undergraduate psychology, which was a question we were asked. Can anyone shout out about what is unusual about this image? Feel free to.
I think everyone's on mute, Sally, but we can.
Looks like a cross between Margaret Thatcher and Boris Johnson upside down.
It could well be.
The one on the left doesn't look like Margaret Thatcher when it's turned the right way around.
That is correct. That is correct. If you go on to the next slide, it's actually the one on the right. That's actually what the picture is, turned upside down. And I don't know how many people have seen this, but this is essentially called the Thatcher illusion, and was all about demonstrating to us how face processing works, that we process faces in a particular way, like holistically, not in separate parts. And that this experiment, which is experimental psychology, brought this to life in these different ways. And that was the purpose of this teaching and lecture. But for me, I realized that over the course of my psychology education, and I'm sorry to say that I've had quite a lot of it over the years, is that this was perhaps the only time a political figure entered my psychological education from undergraduate through to postgraduate, because I've also done a PhD, and it never appeared once. And the fact that that Margaret Thatcher, and I now know that most young people actually don't know who Margaret Thatcher is, which also scares me, but I realize how old I am, but also the impact that those policies had. But that was not discussed as part of this. That was very, very different. So that was just my first reflections when I was finishing, of like, hang on, when have we actually talked about any political policies, issues, when I was training to be basically a therapist? Then the next slide. This was another thing that was became clearer to me, was obviously within the world of psychology and therapy, a lot of emphasis is understandably put on experimental trials, empirical research and evidence, and so particular types of research have a bigger influence than others. But this graph is from a charity called MQ who report on mental health research spending. And this demonstrates, as you can see at the top, the only headline I want to take away from this slide is just so much of the money that is put forward for mental health research, of which there is very little in the comparatively to physical health research anyway. And it's going to universities, obviously it's going to big academic institutions on the whole, which create the evidence base for what we do to support people, is mostly the biggest amount is going to brain function, which is at the top. And the third one down is brain dysfunction. And the second one down is psychiatric populations and services. In other words, built into the system of research is a bias towards the medical model right from the word go. And this will come as no surprise to most people, I'm sure. But therefore, it makes it very difficult to question and to do research on other ways of supporting people through distress that aren't medical model orientated or influenced, or even specific types of individual therapies as well. So again, it was bringing to life for me the different ways that things are hidden, and that it requires quite a lot of initiative to think and do things differently from the mainstream dominant messages we get. Then I'm going to skip the next slide, if I may, and move forward. I might come back to it. So there's another slide, and then, yeah. So that idea of taking initiative and that being easier in some contexts, it felt to me at that point that it felt important to be in a part of a system where I could work towards systemic change alongside supporting people through distress. And even that idea of what is the role of a therapist or a psychologist, or I with others started to question what that meant and what our role was. If our overall role was to improve well-being, reduce distress, what are the ways that we could make that happen? And that led me to think much more broadly, to move into the charity sector, where there's definitely trade-offs, but you have more freedom and autonomy to think about some of these issues. And it also made me think about how I'm part of broader campaigns or activism that can bring together these issues of distress, which is rising in the population, and contextual issues, which are getting harder and harder, and inequality, which is rising, and poverty, which has risen. So yeah, that's when I felt like austerity. So on to the next slide, and back to this idea of when austerity became law, it felt important to me that we started to resist it, both as a professional duty and as a personal duty. And that requires there's things that help create systemic change. And one of the ways to do that is to frame things right and to frame it for the audience. And how do we think about how we encourage other therapists, other psychologists, other psychotherapists to get involved in social change? And it felt to me like we had to make that calling to each other, to frame it correctly, that we have to look, what is our professional duty here? Drawing on historic examples of changes in professions where they've called out things which we know are damaging and distressing, and doing that work ourselves, and speaking to our higher, more courageous selves. And so some of this framing felt really important. And framing generally is really important for how we engage people in social change. So the next section that I'm going to just try and speak to relatively quickly is about the development of psychologists, what was Psychologists Against Austerity, but became Psychologists for Social Change, and sort of pull out, rather than go into the detail of what we did, just sort of continue to pull out like what are the key ingredients that helped us create change. And obviously, you know, ultimately we didn't stop austerity, but we did have some impact in our own profession and more broadly, which is very hard to demonstrate, but we felt it was the beginnings of something which have gone on to change and shift as cultural needs and different injustices have come alive, quite rightly. So our first sort of action was to think about how we as psychologists, what our voice is and how we can be most helpful. And we developed a briefing paper, which is still available, for the strategy of bringing to life some of these context issues rather than just brain issues or individual thinking issues that were actually affecting people's experience of and distress, and how that links to our vision for a psychologically healthier society. And our first strategy was all about creating this document, creating evidence based on our own skills here, and then sending it to all the other austerity campaigns that were happening to support them and boost them and support what they were doing often, rather than trying to run our own campaign. And then, oh, sorry, if you go to the next slide, that's what I was just referring to. So we built this briefing paper, which was all about austerity ailments, how it was having this impact, and then the indicators of what we'd want to see for a psychologically healthier society, which also requires like the material, like the it's not just psychological, there is also a material reality to people's lives. So it was both and those things. Okay, the next slide, please. So yeah, we built a group, which was, as we said, originally Psychologists Against Austerity, and a few years later became Psychologists for Social Change. We are a network. We are all volunteer activists in different roles. We're not, nobody is paid. It's a network of activists, and we wanted to use our voice. I was going on protests about austerity where there was, you know, there was all sorts of professions, nurses, midwives, but there were who were advocating for change, but there was no sign of psychologists. So in this way, what we wanted to do was move things, move the profession forward, and our focus and our audience was our own internal profession and wider therapists. And so, and on to the next slide. We started to develop different activities. We had network meetings. We had different campaigns and working groups. We tied campaigns to other ideas and strategies that had worked, like an everyday austerity campaign, which was inspired by the Everyday Sexism campaign, which was all about noting down what people were seeing in people's lives and in services where austerity and lack of resources was directly affecting people and their distress. We had lots of actions in the run up to the 2015 general election. So there was lots happening. If we go on to the next slide, we were doing writing more briefing papers, and then new groups were establishing themselves all over the country, and new working groups and new ideas. And then the next slide, please. And then I went on, and others went on, a movement builders course, and that really helped us strategize and shift. And I think one of the things that really helps create systemic change is having a really good strategy and really understanding the theory behind social movements and how they build. And as you might imagine, and as you probably may well know, there's as much written about this as there are therapy sessions, you know, and how to develop and build movements, and so much history and learning to build on. So this was really transformative for me, and it's by an organization, or also a network, but an organization as well, called New Economy Organizers Network. And the training was 5 days, and it was brilliant, and it really helped us strategize. So next slide, please. So for example, we started to think about how we are working with others, collaborating, how we're platforming more marginalized voices, how we're mobilizing around particular events, how we are working to bring in and absorbing new members of the network, and how we get people mobilized and active. So loads of strategies around that, those sorts of things. And again, it was really useful to remind myself of like how much thinking has to go into really good strategic campaigning and movement building. Next slide, please. We started to think of ourselves and started to think about the work of Psychologists for Social Change in these 3 different ways. And again, that helped us focus, it helped us mobilize the right action. And I think focus and strategy became core to increasing our impact. And I suppose one of the things that you have to think about, and I'm going to come on to this, and my lesson was like, what are we putting our energy into and why? And is it strategic enough? Who is the audience? Is it framed right? Is the strategy right? Do that thinking before starting anything, because things take such a long time and an amount of energy. You need to know that they're going to be effective. Okay, next slide, please. And similarly, this was a really interesting bit of learning for me around how movements build and go into cycles. And if we think about, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, what happens in a movement, in the building of a movement, and this is again shown across different movements like the civil rights movement. There's this idea at the beginning of a cycle starting with an enduring crisis like austerity or the police brutality and racist policing, and there's like this general growing public anger, and then there's a trigger event like George Floyd. And at that moment when something like that happens, as is what happened, people are ready to mobilize, and there's a huge uprising. And that we saw that happen so much in 2020, 2021, huge uprising against or around those issues. And it reaches a peak and certain things happen and everybody's organizing and mobilizing around it. And then there's a peak of that, and then slowly that contracts and almost there's a backlash, and we've seen that as well. There's a disillusionment, there's people pushing back who aren't happy with the power shift. And that can be quite disillusioning for the activists. But then actually, after a period, there's a new normal, which we're in at the moment. It's not perfect, but there's definitely been a shift in anti-racism, for example, that's very far from finished. But it's like, this is when the cycle will start again. And at each time these cycles happen, there's like movements to be aware of as an individual. How, if a trigger event happens on a cause that you're involved in, or a cause you'd like to be involved in that moment, how can you get active? How can you mobilize? Who can you join? How can you show your support? What can you do as an individual? Or if you're part of a group, this group, for example, this community, what can you be doing? What can you organize around? What can you get ready for? How can you create a trigger event? So that was another big piece of learning, is like, what is it that it might be smaller than obviously smaller than something as horrible as what happened to George Floyd, but it might be a smaller event in your community that you could organize around and create that mobilization effect. And eventually at the beginnings of a new normal. And I do think that is happening within the therapeutic industries, where people are recognizing more and more the impact of social context. It's become more of a discussion point that I've noticed anyway. Okay, and then I think, next slide, please. Yeah, and just to bring to life, like, that was, that really came together for us as well when we were invited to be part of the launch of, I don't know if you remember that film, this is Ken Loach at the front here, the director, the I, Daniel Blake film, which came out. at a moment when austerity was still hitting and the welfare system was really being was really brutal on people, and people were dying. People with disabilities were dying from the impact of the changes to the welfare system. So we went along to the launch of that film, for example. So these are the partnerships and collaborations you can cut across when you're bringing a particular angle to something. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. And then on just another example of that, some work that we've been doing at Art Against Knives, recognizing how so-called youth violence is impacted so much by the context that young people live in. We draw on this model called ecological systems model, which is, I'm sure some of you know, but it's about how the context, the nested context in which people live and grow, and how that affects all aspects of them as an individual and their well-being. And for us, we know poverty is a huge factor in how much risk young people are willing to take in their lives, or are easily exploited in order to get resources that they need. And we did some work with our local community and voluntary sector about what could anti-poverty practice look like at a sector level in Barnet, for example, where we're based, at a borough level. So it's again like that, working across. We had people from the homelessness sector, people from social care, all these different came together and thought about it as a group. So again, there's something there for individuals. If you're working at an individual level, who else could you work with, who's in your borough, what other organisations are out there? Okay, I think that is, next slide, please. Oh gosh, I've got one more example of like changing your strategy to meet your audience. So this was some work we did at MAC UK. Sorry, I realise it's quite a lot of information. I hope it's all making sense. This was some work we did at MAC UK around like, how do we redesign mental health services for not just for excluded young people, but generally, how do we build in the social context into how we think about people's mental health? How do we ask individual practitioners to do that? How do we do it at a service level? And one of the ways that we thought about it was to actually go work with services to think about this question. Imagine you've been asked to create a strategy that reduces the demand for your service over time. What would you do, and how would you do it? And that brought up for people thinking about what data they need. How might you involve the people who use your service in answering this question? What systems are they nested in as part of the ecological systems, and what are the things that would support reducing the demand for the service over time? What interventions, who would you work with? And how would you redesign a service, a mental health service, so that you're reducing the demand for it over time, which is what we should all be doing, right? I feel like we should be doing that as a charity as well. And so that's why we have systems change in our mission. But actually, it's obviously a very long-term goal. But I feel like as a prevention, we should be thinking very strategically. And this was a way of reaching people, practitioners in services, who could then think about it from a service perspective. Okay, I'm going to go on to the stop for a minute and just check in. If you could go to the next slide, sorry. I've got a couple more lessons to go through, but I thought I'd stop and just check in here, or see if anyone wants to say anything.
Thanks, Sally. Is anybody wanting to, Omar?
Yeah, I think I put it in the chat. I believe in a universal basic income. I think it's been spoken about for quite a long time now.
Yeah.
Any government who's obviously in power, especially Labour, I think they should be looking at a potential idea of introducing a universal basic income for everybody, even if that was £50 a week or £60 a week, because if nobody's got any income, basically, they're not going to potentially have a roof over their head. I think these are going to be certain issues what are connected, especially with gangs who are connected through crime, especially, and that can lead on to obviously criminal activity to make money. So I think the idea of pushing for a UBI is really important, and also connecting. Sorry to interrupt. In connecting to that individual, what exactly do they want to do with their lives in a positive way? So.
Couldn't agree more. I don't know if you saw it and that's why you're mentioning it, but we did our third briefing paper was on a psychological assessment of the universal basic income. I've put a link to it in, I think it's in slide 41. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, couldn't agree more. And I'm happy to speak to that more later on if it's useful.
Thanks, Mark. Cassandra, you had your hand up. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. Just quickly, I guess, firstly, thank you, Sally. But secondly, just as you're talking and I guess thinking about going out into sort of the existing systems. So if there's like psychologists for social change, therapy and social change, and all of these sort of subgroups that are doing something similar, I guess it's just sort of had me thinking, I went to a conference last weekend, Black psychotherapy. It's like, is there some sort of through line or alliance that could be made across all of these different smaller actors to kind of unify and amplify the voice of each, but maybe the presence together could be stronger or more impactful. But yeah, anyway, just a reflection. Thank
you. Yeah, thanks. I would agree. There's really good reasons why people have different groups and networks and specialisms, so to speak. And in the movement building training, they talked a bit about the ecosystem of a movement where people are doing slightly different things with slightly different strategies and intentions. But in these crises or in these trigger incident moments, that's when you've got to come together. That's when you've got to see the benefits and strengths of what everybody's bringing and come together and do and try and work effectively. And that's why another part of my lesson in this, actually, which I didn't mention specifically, is about relationships building and reaching out. And a part of what our work came on to do more focus on, although we didn't get it right completely by a long way, but was to try and support, stand in solidarity with, and platform other campaigns and voices, rather than just trying to generate our own stuff all the time.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, thanks, Cassandra. I think that's a really, really important point you raised. And, we've got Sally from Psychologists for Social Change, with Therapy for Social Change. Is it a bit like the Monty Python sketch, where we're all kind of putting for our own things? And I think it's a really interesting question. It's quite a hard question because I think, you kind of get identities and you get alignments with certain movements that are more than just what the movements stand for, but are also about identities. And yeah, I personally, I think there's a value in a kind of, I don't know, in a kind of in a heterogeneous field. I can see the value in the energy. And if we all came together, I could imagine that something would get lost. But I think there's also maybe a risk that we do things in quite a fragmented way. And because so much of what you're talking about there, Sally, I think is so relevant for us as well. It's kind of, you led the way, and the last thing we want to do is kind of recreate the wheel. It's really valuable work that you've been doing.
Well, it's things have moved and changed, and there's not as much activity around that network as there was, although it's still active in many places across the country. But it's because there's other things that people are committing to or needing to commit to, like Gaza, and Palestine, or cost of living, or like there's different things where people are moving, maybe in needing to go more into their communities, for example, or anti-racism. So I think there's quite a lot of demands on our energy, and that's why it's important to be thoughtful about your strategy before you begin and what it is that you're trying to achieve.
What do you think, Sally? Do you think it's useful to have a kind of mixture of different groups that are kind of very close, or do you think it's better to kind of come together more, or both?
Probably both. I think in that training, it talks about different theories of change and what it is. And this was another thing around that we tried to put a bit more into action about thinking is like, what is our actual theory of change? It's like a formulation, you know, but a systemic formulation.
Yeah.
And I think some people are trying to just stand against something. Some people are trying to build alternatives. And I think that's when, or some people are just trying to support people in the here and now with distress, for example, you know, and finding different ways of doing that. And so you kind of need all their argument. Neon's argument is that you need all of them. So I guess it's like, how aligned would different groups be? And therefore, then what do people want in those groups? But we're kind of talking about professional groups here, I suppose. But in community psychology work, it's about specific communities, and they're often neighborhood based rather than necessarily network based, you know. And a lot of our work at Art Against Knives is with a particular community of young people who are based in North London on particular housing estates, or you know, and so there it's much more relevant that it's led by them, for them, and then at times they'll come together in the big collective of people who are affected by the policies. I'm going to come on to talk about like some of what's important to young people.
Yeah. Just before you do that, Sally, Kieran, I don't know if do you want me to read out your question, or do you want to come off mute and
Oh no, this is just me getting excited.
Oh, hi, Kieran.
Hey, I'm working in a more network-based way as a community psychologist across Southeast London, so it's not geographically in one area, but we are working with community organisations, either with circle focused or adjacent, and I just wondered if like you could link us up potentially with MedAct around some of our movement building strategy. It was actually Sally that told me about the movement building course, so I've been using that in some of the work that I've been doing, so we know each other already. I was just being cheeky.
Not at all. Kieran's very active and amazing, does lots of amazing different projects and work.
I do sometimes.
Sally, we got about 10 minutes left. Did you want to go on?
I'm going to just do one more lesson. I knew this would happen, that I wouldn't get through them all, but I'm okay with that. I can't remember what the next one is, and then I'll shut up. I will do the one that's on slide 28, please, which is a couple more. This one, yeah. I think this is just one that I've been learning in a formal leadership role, and lots to think about when you're doing work with marginalized communities, which is the focus of community psychology and should be the focus of social change work. And there's lots of unlearning to do, and there's lots of humility that's required when I get things wrong, and when I assume things, when I haven't realized something that's where I think I'm trying to do something useful and other people aren't experiencing it that way, and all of those things, and moving at the pace of trust and relationships whilst also trying to get things done. And it's just really hard. And I used to say, you know, that a lot of my energy, all my energy should be focused on creating social change. And even as a psychologist, and ironically, it's taken me, you know, the challenges of trying to do that, which have made me also go, okay, I actually have to do some internal interrogation work as well on my own relationship to power, my own relationship to privilege, and things like, oh, I say I'm anti-capitalist, but I also seem to really value productivity and get frustrated when things aren't productive, or I seem to uphold certain capitalist structures in my organization that impact people. And I realize that it's not a personal inadequacy, it's a systemic issue that has created conditioning. And also that it's, you know, inevitable. I'm going to make mistakes as a white person, for example, working on issues like whiteness. And also it's inevitable that, you know, with the systems like the funding systems we have, for example, that there's going to be tight conflict. And I think my lesson is there's a lot of unlearning to do, and it's hard. And I just coming back, a core value of community psychology is humility and listening, and really working at the pace of trust. So that would be my skip to final lesson. So we've got some time to chat.
Thanks, Sally. Oh, I'll put my hand up. So do we have, you know, there's so much there. It'd be really nice to have more time to talk about it. Do we have comments or questions or things people wanted to raise? Omar.
Yeah, just want to pick up on what Sally said about funding. I just feel like funding, possibly at this time, is really difficult for a lot of organisations. So it's like everybody's kind of fighting over funding. I know in the positions I do, especially in lead panels, and I've just got a job with the NIHR, everything's based around what exactly are people going to be doing after an intervention, or they've taken a medication. Are they going to be going back to work? Are they going to be going into education? Are they going to be becoming a taxpayer? And that's probably something difficult for me, of working previously in mental health services and watching the complete change of austerity, especially in 2013, 2014, especially with the companies like Atos and Maximus, private IT companies assessing people on welfare, which were, in my opinion, quite corrupt. So I just don't know where we're going to go with the systems. Like, and are we going to continue in a world of privatization, or are we going to kind of step back and say this isn't acceptable? And I think maybe we could bring that up with Task, especially. I don't know what Mick thinks. Do we want a world with privatization, or do we want a world what is a bit more human and accepting?
I'll pass that one over to Sally.
Are you passing it back to me?
Yeah.
I'll let someone else respond. I know what I would say, but
Tell us what you'd say. Maybe other people have thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's got worse, hasn't it? That's what's hard about all of this social change work, is it's getting harder because the far right, and I suppose I'm bringing my quite obvious political leanings here, but that is the point, is that as psychologists and therapists, we're often trained that we shouldn't be bringing political leanings, and that remaining neutral, which is a very white Eurocentric perspective, because that's where it's come from, means remaining politically neutral. And that's not the same as remaining party political neutral, because I think that can be important in campaigning, obviously, and especially as a charity. But we are conditioned into this idea that we need to be politically neutral when it comes to things like privatization or particular policies, or and our activism in the workplace.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to be really quick. I do agree on what you're saying, but I think what I'd like to see is, I'd like to see us push the government to try and push these private corporations back. They've got 2 or 3 year contracts, especially Maximus. They're an IT company assessing seriously ill people, and I would like to see us do something about that. You know, because if we don't, then more private companies will come into the NHS and other organisations, and people will end up suffering. So sorry about that.
No, I agree.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you, Sally, is so maybe a little bit more about leadership, and like, how do you, because I think that's something that I've really seen in you, like that kind of you taking the initiative when you're talking about that as well, about leading. And I wonder how you balance that against a kind of more, I don't know, democratic, or like I guess there's a risk in leadership that it becomes, you know, that there's the power that comes with leadership, but at the same time, I guess if I was thinking about my learnings, I think there is something so important about people taking leadership roles, which I've always hated that word and find really uncomfortable.
Yeah, 100%. It's really challenging when also I have quite a difficult relationship to power in its most formal role, and so people have said to me, why have you taken a CEO job? And I'm like, yeah, it's been a good question, but I love the work, and I love what we do, and I love all of our team and the young people, and sometimes leadership means stepping in and taking the initiative, and sometimes it really means stepping back and allowing other people allowing other people to step in, and it's hard to know which of those are most wanted. Within, for example, at my current organization, we've been talking about distributed leadership and decentralizing leadership and collective decision making, and not everybody wants that as well. Like, that's my assumption, that that's a good thing, and you have that's something that we need to collectively decide, ironically, if how far we go with that, and is that about me? Is that about my own relationship to power, or is that about uplifting others? But then, all of the challenges again around funding, and but to me, I suppose the work of co-production is where you work in partnership with the community. So that feels like it's really important that the community has ownership as much as possible about certain actions that you're going to take and decisions. And sometimes that does mean that your ideas have to take a back seat and uplift other people's ideas. And I think that's much easier in the charity sector as a leader to do that. And in fact, it's actively encouraged. Whereas in settings like the NHS, it's harder to do that because they've got other criteria by which you're supposed to lead.
How have you done it? Yeah, and how have you done it in Psychologists for Social Change? Like, because it's interesting, that's kind of like a professional organization, and I guess that in itself has power, doesn't it? And there's more stuff to square there in a way.
Yeah. Again, there was loads of learning around this. And I think we ended up writing this really complicated handbook about how we were going to try and empower others within the network to take decisions and make decisions around what campaigns, for example, we focused on, or how to make decisions as a network. And it came at a really difficult time because it was during the pandemic, but it felt like it was quite hard to embed and shift power around and leadership around. And we tried, but it is hard because, there can be kind of vacuums left if people leave, or things don't get taken up. But there's got to be quite a strong processes, I suppose, around leadership in flat networks. There's got to be strong processes of who's doing what and how conflict is resolved or how decisions get made. And there are lots of tools for that in the world. And the handbook used some of them, but then you've got to embed them in people's practices. And again, people are used to hierarchy. And it's quite hard to undo hierarchy.
Yeah. Thanks, Sally. Kieran?
I'll just add to that you end up and this is a very common issue with a lot of community organisations, relying too much on very few people to keep things going. And when they stop, then networks tend to fall apart. And that is also in itself quite exhausting to navigate. So it's not just about power, it's about responsibility as well. Yeah, that's, I think, another thing that made it go dormant for a while. Some of us just ran out of energy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks, Kieran. I'm just aware we're up to time. Sally, it's been brilliant to listen to you, and thank you for coming to join us.